Hello, welcome to the first real episode of the Auditioning Euphonium. Today I wanted to cover the Stars and Stripes Forever. The reason I chose this piece is because it's a huge staple of the euphonium rep, and most people usually call for this in auditions. So, let's just dive right in. The Stars and Stripes Forever was written actually on a boat in 1896 on Christmas Day, whenever Sousa was coming back from a trip out of country. The first actual performance of the piece wasn't until 1897 on May 14th in Philadelphia. Whenever it was first played, it didn't really get that much recognition compared to his other marches. Soon after the premiere, though, it just started snowballing and it started gaining more acceptance until finally it was made into the national march. Well, anyway, that's a little bit about the history. So, if we actually dive right into the euphonium part, there's a lot there that is kind of hidden. So, just looking at the introduction, we already have two different kinds of stylistic markings. And some things to consider are both the style in which you enter in, and also how you're going to play those marcato notes. I myself used to play those a true marcato, really short and powerful. But I got some great insight recently. Those marcato notes are actually supposed to be played longer than you think. So make sure that I would almost play them with a tenuto style as well as the accent. Continuing on, our first strain. So there's a little things that I want to talk about in this section. The key here, especially with a lot of Sousa marches and the role of the euphonium, is how he changes what we do. The first two measures of our first strain, they're more of the bass line. We're playing that with the trombones and the tubas. It's really powerful, really big. But then the next two measures, we're actually floating up with the melody. And so this is kind of the trend that he has us going with. It's usually sectioned off by 2 bars. So first 2 bars we have bass, next 2 bars we have melody. The next 2 bars we're at bass again. The next 2 bars were at melody, and then we go into this piano section. I really like to emphasize the subito piano as he has a crescendo written and then a piano marking. The next thing that I like to consider is a lot of people generally put a crescendo from that piano to the next forte. That's really denoting also the melody and the bass line, again, for our part. So, again, I like to put the crescendo. If you don't put the crescendo, that's fine. You just have to make sure that you sell the style with whatever you do. So for my sake, put the crescendo, get to that forte again, and once you're back to the melody, usually people back off again, and then put another crescendo back to the repeat. Once you do repeats and marches, it's always important to make a dynamic difference. That was always the classical thing to do with marches, and I feel that it is extremely important to always show this in an audition, especially if they want you to do the repeats. Moving on, so our second strain. Our second strain it's marked fortissimo. It's the third time we've seen it now, but this section is usually really big, but it's also a place where a lot of players slow down since it's a lot of half notes back to back. So I would really practice these transitions going from the first strain to the second strain with a metronome to make sure that you still feel that internalized pulse. The next thing, there are very few marcatos in this section, but they are very important. They're placed in kind of awkward places. It's always important to show exactly where they're supposed to be and don't let any other note sound like that marcato, just because they were put there for a reason. After the marcatos, our next important stylistic marking is an accent. The accent isn't really something that we would think about, but if you look at it, the very first measure of our second strain, we have a marcato on that C, and then whenever our melody repeats, we have an accent. So whether you want to make that difference or want to call back to the first time you play it, that's up to you, but I like to really show that difference by just making it a true accent. Moving on, another thing in this section is the kind of awkward slurs. I call them awkward just because I feel like they're awkward. A lot of people like the way that they're slurred. I usually try to slur the high E flat to the G. That's a no-no. There's not a slur written, and frankly, it doesn't sound like the Sousa March once you start breaking all the slurs that are there. So make sure that the slurs are very accurately placed. But also, one thing that I want to point out is the second note of each slur. Usually what happens in those is they get clipped short because we're thinking march style, that it has to be short, has to be concise. But make sure that those lengths are still the same as the first note. If they don't resonate as much, then that's really just a hit on you. Doesn't really do you much good. And that'll be it for today. I really just wanted to point out the first and second strain just so that we can get an understanding of this piece. Next time, I will review from the trio to the end. And have a good audition.